Here's what happened. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was found unconscious in his Graceland bathroom on August 16th, 1977. His girlfriend, Ginger Alden, discovered him. He was just 42 years old. The news shocked the world. It stopped everything. And it started a lot of questions. The immediate reports said he died of a heart attack. Cardiac arrest was the official cause. But almost right away, rumors started. People talked about drug use. They whispered about his doctor, Dr. George Nikopoulos. And the official story, well, it always felt a little too simple for such a complex figure. Elvis had a history. A long one. He had chronic pain. He had insomnia. He relied heavily on prescription medications. Lots of them. He was famous, yes. But he was also struggling. His health had been declining for years. And that led to a lot of speculation. What if we had all the facts now? What if 18 of the best forensic pathologists, unbiased and with all the modern tools, looked at everything? What if they could re-examine the original autopsy, the toxicology reports, the medical history, the entire scene? What might they say? And how different would their conclusions be from what we were told back then? It's a question that still haunts fans and medical experts alike. The truth sometimes is much more complicated than the official records suggest, and it often leaves more questions than answers. Number 18. What was the real immediate cause of death? When Elvis Presley died, the world was told it was a heart attack. The official death certificate, signed by Dr. Jerry Francisco, listed cardiac arrest as the immediate cause. But, that simple phrase, while technically accurate for anyone whose heart stops, doesn't tell the whole story. And it certainly didn't satisfy many, especially not a group of modern forensic pathologists looking back at the case. They would want to dig deeper. For some pathologists, perhaps the most straightforward ones, they might accept the initial finding at face value, but then immediately ask what caused the cardiac arrest. A heart doesn't just stop for no reason, and a 42-year-old, even one with Elvis's lifestyle. They would point to the initial autopsy report, which did note some enlargement of the heart, consistent with someone under chronic strain. But even Dr. Francisco, the medical examiner for Shelby County, Tennessee, admitted the autopsy findings were not as revealing as one would expect. And that's a huge red flag for any forensic expert. One pathologist might focus on the physical evidence or the lack thereof. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no foul play was suspected, so the death was natural in a broad sense. But natural deaths, especially sudden ones, have underlying causes. Dr. Francisco initially stated that drugs had no role in Elvis's death, a claim he later revised under pressure. This immediate deflection, this rushing to a conclusion, would make any modern pathologist suspicious. They would ask why the initial report seemed to minimize or outright deny the known context of Elvis's prolific drug use. And then there's the scene itself. Elvis was found face down on the bathroom floor. The position of the body, the immediate surroundings would all be meticulously scrutinized. Were there signs of a struggle? Was there vomit? Was there anything to suggest a sudden, violent event or a slow decline? The official report simply stated he was found, but for a pathologist, every detail counts in reconstructing those final moments. They might wonder if the rush to declare a natural death, possibly to protect Elvis's image, led to a less thorough initial assessment of the scene and the physical presentation. Later, in 1994, the toxicology reports from Elvis's death were reviewed by a panel of medical examiners. They concluded that Elvis's death was primarily due to a polypharmacy effect, meaning the interaction of multiple prescription drugs, which ultimately led to cardiac arrhythmia. This re-evaluation decades later strongly suggests that the initial cardiac arrest was merely the final symptom, not the root cause. A modern pathologist would have started there, with the polypharmacy, and traced its effects to the heart. The original report by Dr. Francisco was also criticized for its vagueness regarding the drug levels found. It was brief, it lacked specific details that later emerged, and this omission alone would raise questions from any pathologist trained in detailed documentation. They would want to know every milligram, every metabolite, and how these levels compare to therapeutic and toxic ranges, especially in a chronic user who might have built up a tolerance. So, while cardiac arrest might be the simplest answer, it's far from the complete one. Pathologists would argue that the immediate cause was a cardiac event, yes, but that event was not spontaneous. It was likely provoked, and it was provoked by a complex interplay of factors, with his prescription drug regimen at the forefront. Shocking questions. Did the initial report miss something obvious, or was it intentionally vague to protect a legacy? How much did the circumstances of his fame influence the official findings? And could a different, more detailed initial assessment have changed the entire public perception of his death? Number 17. How did the polypharmacy impact his heart? Most forensic pathologists would quickly zero in on the numerous drugs in Elvis's system. They wouldn't see cardiac arrest as a standalone event. Instead, they would see it as the endpoint of a cascade. A cascade fueled by polypharmacy, the simultaneous use of multiple medications. This is a critical area for anyone trying to understand his death. On the day he died, toxicology reports revealed significant levels of several powerful prescription drugs. These included Dilaudid, Percodan, Demerol, codeine, Quaaludes, and others. These aren't just pain relievers, they are central nervous system depressants. And when mixed, their effects are amplified, sometimes synergistically. One pathologist might focus on how Dilaudid, a potent opioid, could suppress the respiratory drive, leading to a lack of oxygen. This hypoxia, a shortage of oxygen, would then put immense strain on the heart, eventually causing it to fail. Another pathologist might emphasize the role of Quaaludes. This sedative hypnotic drug, while intended for sleep, can cause respiratory depression at high doses, especially when combined with other depressants. They might cite studies from the 1970s and 80s on the dangers of methaqualone Quaaludes overdose, which often involved respiratory arrest preceding cardiac failure. The combination with opioids would make this effect even more pronounced. Then there's the issue of the heart itself. While the autopsy noted an enlarged heart, this alone doesn't prove an acute cardiac event. But chronic drug abuse, particularly stimulants and depressants taken erratically, can profoundly affect cardiac function over time. Some pathologists would point to research showing how long-term opioid use can lead to conditions like QT prolongation and electrical abnormality of the heart that makes it more susceptible to fatal arrhythmias. This isn't just theory, it's a known medical risk, and it wasn't just depressants. Elvis had a history of using stimulants too, like dexedrine, though they may not have been present in lethal amounts at the time of death. The constant cycling of uppers and downers would put enormous stress on the cardiovascular system. It would be like constantly revving an engine and then slamming on the brakes. This erratic physiological state would weaken the heart muscle, making it vulnerable. A pathologist specializing in cardiovascular pathology might point to subtle signs of microinfarcts or stress-induced cardiomyopathy that could have accumulated over years. Consider Dr. Forrest Tennant, a pain management specialist who later reviewed Elvis's records. He argued that Elvis's various health problems, including an enlarged colon and severe back pain, led to extensive painkiller use. And this chronic pain and chronic medication use ultimately put his system under extraordinary duress. The polypharmacy, in his view, didn't just cause an acute overdose, it created a chronic state of vulnerability. So the question isn't just about what drug killed him, it's about how the cocktail of drugs ingested over an extended period and acutely created a fatal situation for his heart. Each drug had its own effect, but their combined impact was far greater than the sum of their parts. This synergistic depression of the central nervous system, leading to respiratory failure and ultimately cardiac arrest, would be the consensus among many pathologists. The heart simply couldn't keep up with the demands placed on it by a body struggling under the weight of so many chemicals. A shocking question: was one specific drug the tipping point, or was it truly impossible to isolate a single culprit? Could the doctors prescribing these medications have truly understood the cumulative cardiac risk they were creating? And how many other celebrities, or even regular people, silently succumbed to similar polypharmacy effects? Number 16 was Dr. Nick truly negligent or just enabling? Dr. George Nicopolis, known to Elvis as Dr. Nick, was more than just Elvis's personal physician. He was a constant companion, a confidant, and ultimately a controversial figure in the story of Elvis's death. The question for forensic pathologists isn't just about what drugs were found, but who supplied them and under what circumstances. And this brings Dr. Nick directly into the spotlight. Many pathologists, especially those with experience in medical malpractice or ethical reviews, would scrutinize Dr. Nick's prescribing habits. The sheer volume of prescriptions was staggering. Records later showed that in the last 8 months of Elvis's life alone, Dr. Nick prescribed over 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics. That number alone would set off alarm bells for any medical professional. It points to a level of access and indulgence far beyond standard medical practice. One pathologist might argue that Dr. Nick's actions constituted gross negligence. They would cite the accepted standards of care in the 1970s, which, while perhaps less stringent than today, still prohibited such excessive prescribing, especially to a known addict. The medical profession has always had ethical guidelines about not enabling drug dependency. Dr. Nick's defense often centered on his attempts to control Elvis's drug use by prescribing pure forms of drugs or smaller doses, or even placebos, to prevent him from seeking street drugs. But this argument, to a pathologist, would sound like justification for a dangerous approach, not a responsible one. Another pathologist might see Dr. Nick as an enabler, trapped in a difficult situation. Elvis was a powerful, famous, and often intimidating figure. His demands for drugs were relentless. Dr. Nick himself said, "Elvis's wanting to stay thin and awake was a constant battle for me. If he couldn't get the medicine from me, he would get it from somebody else, or from the street." This perspective suggests a doctor caught between his patient's destructive demands and his own medical obligations. But for a forensic pathologist, this doesn't absolve him. The duty of care is paramount. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners suspended Dr. Nicopoulos's license for 3 months in 1980 for indiscriminately prescribing drugs to Elvis and other patients. This official finding supports the view that his practices were, at the very least, inappropriate. Later, in 1993, his license was permanently revoked after further accusations of overprescribing to other patients. These official actions lend significant weight to the argument that Dr. Nick's medical judgment was compromised. Pathologists would also consider the nature of the relationship. It wasn't a typical doctor-patient dynamic. While Dr. Nick was part of Elvis's inner circle, he traveled with him, lived with him, and was paid generously. This closeness, while appearing supportive, could blur ethical lines. It creates a situation where a doctor might prioritize the patient's immediate comfort or demands over their long-term health and safety. So, was it negligence, or was it enabling born from a complex, almost symbiotic relationship? Many pathologists would likely conclude it was both. His willingness to provide such a vast quantity of powerful drugs, regardless of Elvis's threats to find them elsewhere, falls outside the bounds of responsible medical care. It was a failure to protect his patient, ultimately contributing to the circumstances of his death. Shocking questions. How much pressure can a famous patient exert on their doctor? And at what point does it become unethical to comply? Dr. Nick had refused Elvis's demands. Would Elvis have lived longer, or simply found another enabler? And what accountability do doctors truly face when their famous patients die from prescribed medications? Number 15. What role did his chronic constipation play? This might seem like a strange question when discussing a heart attack, but for some forensic pathologists, especially those looking at the complete picture of Elvis's health, his severe chronic constipation and enlarged colon are central to understanding his systemic decline. It's a connection that often gets overlooked in favor of the more sensational drug narrative. Elvis suffered from what's known as megacolon, an abnormally dilated colon. This condition caused him intense pain and led to extreme constipation. He would sometimes go weeks without a bowel movement. To combat this, he used powerful laxatives constantly, and this constant battle with his bowels, according to some experts, contributed significantly to his overall poor health and may have even played a direct role in his death. One prominent proponent of this theory is Dr. Forrest Tennant, the pain specialist who later reviewed Elvis's medical records extensively. Dr. Tennant argues that Elvis's enlarged colon was not just a symptom but a major driver of his ill health. He suggests that the severe straining associated with chronic constipation could have triggered a vagal response. The vagus nerve, when stimulated, can slow the heart rate dramatically, leading to bradycardia or even asystole, the heart stopping. This is a known physiological mechanism, often called the defecation syncope. For a person with an already compromised heart, this could be fatal. Furthermore, a severely impacted colon can lead to a condition called fecal impaction. This creates a buildup of toxins in the body. These toxins, absorbed through the intestinal wall, would put additional stress on his liver and kidneys, already working overtime to process the massive amounts of drugs in his system. A pathologist might see evidence of liver or kidney dysfunction in his autopsy report, linking it to the chronic gut issues. The sheer physical discomfort and pain from his colon issues would also contribute to his reliance on painkillers. It's a vicious cycle. The pain necessitated opioids, and opioids are notorious for causing severe constipation, thereby worsening his underlying colon problem. A pathologist would recognize this feedback loop as a key component of his overall health deterioration. Some might also point to the psychological stress. Imagine living with such severe, constant abdominal pain and discomfort. This chronic stress would elevate cortisol levels, which can have detrimental effects on cardiovascular health over time, including increased blood pressure and inflammation. While harder to pinpoint definitively in an autopsy, the effects of chronic stress are well documented in medical literature. So, while not the direct immediate cause of cardiac arrest, the chronic colon issue and the straining it required could have been the trigger for the vagal response that led to his heart stopping. It's a plausible pathway that connects a seemingly unrelated condition directly to his ultimate demise. A pathologist reviewing his records would see the colon as a significant, chronic health challenge that weakened his system and made him vulnerable. Shocking questions. Could such a seemingly unrelated gastrointestinal issue be the true overlooked trigger for his final collapse? How many other unexplained sudden deaths might have a similar hidden root cause in bowel dysfunction? And could better management of this chronic condition have saved Elvis's life, even with his drug use? Number 14. Were the toxicology results truly conclusive about an overdose? The toxicology report is often seen as the smoking gun in drug-related deaths. But for forensic pathologists, interpreting these results, especially from a historical case like Elvis's, is far from straightforward. The question isn't just what drugs were present, but how much of each, and what that truly means for someone with a long history of chronic drug use. When the toxicology report was finally released in 1979, it showed significant levels of Dilaudid, Percodan, Demerol, codeine, and Quaaludes in Elvis's system. But what constitutes a lethal dose for someone like Elvis? That's where the debate begins for pathologists. One pathologist might look at the individual drug levels and argue that no single drug was present in a definitively lethal concentration on its own. For example, the levels of codeine or Demerol might be considered within a therapeutic range for a chronic user with high tolerance. This perspective would lean towards the idea that it wasn't a massive, acute overdose of one specific substance. However, another pathologist would immediately counter this by emphasizing the concept of polypharmacy or drug potentiation. This means that when multiple drugs are taken together, their effects aren't just additive, they can be synergistic. The depressant effects of opioids, Dilaudid, Percodan, Demerol, codeine, combined with a sedative hypnotic Quaaludes, would greatly amplify the risk of respiratory depression and central nervous system collapse. Even if individual levels seem non-lethal, the combination can be profoundly toxic. This is a well-established principle in pharmacology and toxicology. Furthermore, pathologists would consider the concept of tolerance. Elvis was a chronic, heavy user of these medications. His body had adapted to high doses. What might be lethal for a naive user could be tolerated by him. But even with tolerance, there's a limit. And tolerance doesn't always apply equally to all effects. For example, tolerance to the euphoric effects of opioids develops quickly, but tolerance to the respiratory depressant effects develops more slowly, making chronic users still vulnerable to respiratory arrest. And there's the issue of postmortem redistribution. After death, drugs can move from one tissue to another, and their concentrations can change in blood samples. This phenomenon can make interpreting postmortem toxicology challenging. While methods exist to account for this, it adds a layer of complexity that a discerning pathologist would acknowledge. Was the blood sample representative of the levels at the moment of death, or slightly altered? The panel of medical experts who reviewed the toxicology reports in 1994, led by Dr. Ronald Kornblum, concluded that the sheer number of drugs, even if individually at therapeutic levels for a chronic user, created a drug interaction effect that was ultimately lethal. They called it polypharmacy and considered it the primary cause of his death, leading to cardiac arrhythmia. This later finding essentially confirmed that the combination, not necessarily an acute overdose of a single drug, was the culprit. So, while it wasn't a classic massive single drug overdose that someone might take to end their life, the toxicology results, when properly interpreted through the lens of polypharmacy and chronic use, were indeed conclusive. They pointed to a lethal cocktail that overwhelmed his system. Shocking questions: could the drugs have been at lower levels just hours before his death, suggesting a different acute trigger? How precisely can we interpret drug levels in a body after death, accounting for all variables? And does the distinction between an overdose and polypharmacy truly matter if the outcome is the same? Number 13, what signs of chronic organ damage were overlooked? Elvis Presley's body, by the time of his death, was a testament to years of abuse and neglect, both self-inflicted and medically enabled. For forensic pathologists, looking beyond the immediate cause of death involves examining the cumulative damage to his vital organs. While the official autopsy was brief, modern pathologists would be looking for subtle signs of chronic organ damage that could have predisposed him to sudden death. His liver, for instance, would be a major area of concern. The liver is the body's primary detoxifier. With the constant influx of prescription drugs, opioids, sedatives, stimulants, and other medications, and his liver would have been under immense strain for years. A pathologist would be looking for signs of fatty liver disease, hepatitis, even drug-induced non-viral forms, or fibrosis. Chronic drug use, especially acetaminophen-containing painkillers like Percodan, can cause significant liver damage. While not directly lethal in an acute sense, a compromised liver means the body is less efficient at clearing toxins, making all the other drugs more potent and their effects longer lasting. Then there are his kidneys. They filter waste products from the blood. Prolonged exposure to high doses of various drugs, especially some painkillers, can impair kidney function. Pathologists would look for signs of nephropathy or kidney disease. If his kidneys were struggling, it would further contribute to a buildup of toxic substances in his system, exacerbating the effects of the polypharmacy. A pathologist might see evidence of chronic kidney disease as a silent contributor to his overall fragility. His heart, already discussed, showed enlargement in the autopsy. This isn't just from acute strain. It suggests chronic stress on the cardiovascular system, possibly from long-term hypertension, high blood pressure, or the constant cycling of stimulants and depressants. Myocardial hypertrophy, or thickening of the heart muscle, can reduce its efficiency and make it more prone to arrhythmias. A pathologist with a cardiac specialization might look for evidence of diffuse myocardial fibrosis, a scarring of the heart muscle, which can impair electrical conduction and lead to fatal heart rhythms. And let's not forget his gastrointestinal system, specifically his colon. As mentioned before, his megacolon was a source of chronic pain and toxin absorption, but it also puts systemic stress on the body. Chronic inflammation or infection stemming from such an impaired system could trigger a generalized inflammatory response, impacting other organs. Some pathologists would also consider the impact on his brain. While an autopsy primarily focuses on gross pathology, the long-term effects of chronic drug use on neural pathways, cognitive function, and mental health are profound. Though not a direct cause of death, the impaired judgment and decision-making that come with such addiction contributed to his inability to break free from the cycle of drug abuse. The lack of a detailed, publicly available autopsy report that explicitly addresses these potential chronic damages is a major gap. A modern forensic pathologist, given the opportunity, would meticulously document every organ for signs of long-term wear and tear. They would argue that Elvis's death wasn't just an acute event, it was the final collapse of a body weakened by years of systemic drug-induced degradation and underlying health issues. His organs were not just failing in the end, they had been slowly deteriorating for a long time. Shocking questions. Was his body just a ticking time bomb, destined to fail regardless of the specific day? How much more detail would a modern organ-by-organ analysis reveal about his physical decline? And what level of chronic drug use is truly sustainable before irreversible organ damage becomes a certainty? Number 12. How reliable is the original autopsy report by Dr. Francisco? The original autopsy report, conducted by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner for Shelby County, Tennessee, has been a source of controversy and skepticism almost since the day Elvis died. For forensic pathologists looking back, this report is not just a document, it's a primary piece of evidence that needs critical evaluation, and many would find it lacking. One pathologist might immediately point to Dr. Francisco's initial public statements. He famously declared, "Elvis Presley died of cardiac arrhythmia. There was no evidence of any other contributing disease or condition, such as drug abuse." This statement, made so quickly after the death and before the full toxicology results were known, would raise a huge red flag. It suggests a rush to judgment or, worse, a deliberate attempt to downplay the role of drugs. For a forensic pathologist, objectivity and a thorough investigation are paramount before making definitive statements. Another pathologist might critique the level of detail, or rather, the lack thereof, in the official report. While the autopsy confirmed an enlarged heart, it largely avoided specifics on other potential issues. A comprehensive autopsy should be a meticulous accounting of every organ system, noting any pathology, no matter how minor. The brevity of Francisco's report, especially for such a high-profile case, suggests either an incomplete examination or a selective release of information. The very choice of Dr. Francisco himself was questioned. He had a reputation for being somewhat controversial, and some believed he was politically motivated or easily influenced. This perception, while not directly impacting the scientific findings, certainly casts a shadow over the report's credibility for external review. Any forensic expert would consider the context and the examiner's history. The subsequent review of Elvis's death, notably the 1994 panel of forensic experts, completely contradicted Dr. Francisco's initial findings regarding drugs. They concluded that the drug use was a significant contributing factor to his death. This direct contradiction, coming from other qualified professionals, is damning for the original report. It suggests that Dr. Francisco either made an error in judgment, lacked crucial information, or intentionally obscured the truth. One specific area of concern for pathologists would be the state of Elvis's colon. While Dr. Francisco did note the enlarged colon, he didn't appear to give it the weight that later experts did in the context of Elvis's overall health and drug use. This might be seen as an oversight, considering how debilitating and potentially systemic the megacolon was. Furthermore, the lack of extensive external independent review at the time of death is also a point of contention. In high-profile cases, multiple pathologists or a panel often review findings to ensure transparency and accuracy. This did not happen initially, allowing Dr. Francisco's singular interpretation to stand for years. So, for many forensic pathologists today, Dr. Francisco's original autopsy report is less a definitive conclusion and more a starting point for further questions. Its initial public claims, its lack of granular detail, and its ultimate contradiction by later expert reviews all combine to make it a document of questionable reliability. It served its purpose at the time to provide a quick, simple answer, but it failed to deliver a full, transparent, and medically robust account of Elvis Presley's complex demise. Shocking Questions was the initial report designed to protect Elvis's image and legacy, sacrificing scientific rigor. If the autopsy had been performed by a different, more meticulous medical examiner, would the public narrative of his death have been entirely different from the start? And how often are such reports swayed by the powerful figures involved in a death? Number 11. Could an allergic reaction have played a part? It's a less common theory, but for a group of 18 forensic pathologists, exploring every possibility is crucial. Could Elvis Presley have suffered an idiosyncratic drug reaction, a severe adverse event that wasn't a typical overdose, but rather an allergic or hypersensitive response to one of the many medications in his system? This would be a more challenging finding to prove, but a pathologist would certainly consider it. An idiosyncratic drug reaction isn't dose-dependent like a typical overdose. It's an unpredictable, unique response of an individual's body to a drug. For instance, some people can develop a severe, life-threatening reaction to an opioid, even at a therapeutic dose, leading to respiratory collapse or cardiac arrhythmias. This isn't an allergy in the traditional sense, but an individual's unique metabolism or genetic makeup can lead to an exaggerated or harmful response. One pathologist might suggest that with the cocktail of drugs Elvis was taking, the chances of such an unpredictable interaction increase exponentially. Each drug, while usually tolerated, could, in combination with others, trigger an adverse pathway. For example, some drugs can cause a condition called torsades de pointe, a specific type of ventricular tachycardia, a fast, abnormal heart rhythm that can lead to sudden cardiac death. While often associated with specific antiarrhythmic drugs, other medications, especially in combination, can also prolong the QT interval and predispose an individual to this. The challenge, of course, is proving this post-mortem. Unlike a typical allergic reaction with visible signs like hives or angioedema swelling, an idiosyncratic cardiac or respiratory event might leave no clear physical markers on autopsy. Toxicology would show the presence of the drugs, but not necessarily the reason for the unique reaction. Modern techniques like genetic testing pharmacogenomics could potentially identify predispositions to certain drug reactions, but such technology was decades away in 1977. However, a pathologist with a focus on rare drug effects would look for subtle clues. Were there any documented previous near misses where Elvis experienced unusually severe reactions to a particular drug? Were there any signs of an acute inflammatory response that might suggest a systemic reaction, even if not a classic anaphylaxis? The lack of these observable signs makes this theory harder to substantiate, but it cannot be entirely ruled out. Consider the complexity of his system. Elvis was not a healthy individual. He had chronic pain, likely underlying inflammatory issues, and a compromised digestive system. His immune system could have been weakened or overactive. In such a compromised state, his body might have reacted unpredictably to the chemical onslaught. It's a perfect storm scenario where the drugs didn't just cause a predictable overdose but triggered an unforeseen internal catastrophe. So, while the evidence would be circumstantial and difficult to confirm without specific biomarkers, a meticulous pathologist would certainly entertain the possibility. The lack of a clear, single lethal dose of any one drug, combined with the extreme polypharmacy, leaves room for the unpredictable. Shocking questions. How do you prove an idiosyncratic drug reaction post-mortem without specific markers, and could medical science in 1977 ever have identified such a subtle cause? Could a rare genetic predisposition have made Elvis uniquely vulnerable to his medication regimen? And how many other deaths attributed to cardiac arrest are actually undiagnosed rare drug reactions? Number 10, was his diet and lifestyle a contributing factor? Beyond the dramatic story of drugs and doctors, any comprehensive forensic review of Elvis Presley's death must consider his overall diet and lifestyle. These factors, while not causing an acute death directly, significantly weakened his body over time, making him more vulnerable to the final fatal event. Pathologists would see these as critical underlying contributors, much like the foundation crumbling beneath a house. Elvis's diet was legendary, and not in a good way. He loved rich, high-fat, high-calorie foods. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches, fried foods, massive portions. He often ate late at night. This kind of diet is a recipe for cardiovascular disease, obesity, and other metabolic issues. One pathologist might highlight the effects of chronic high cholesterol and saturated fat intake on his arteries. Even at 42 years of this diet could lead to atherosclerosis, a hardening and narrowing of the arteries, including those supplying the heart. While his official autopsy didn't report severe coronary artery disease, it doesn't rule out more subtle, diffuse damage or plaque instability. His weight fluctuated wildly, but in his later years, he was significantly overweight, if not obese. Obesity is a major risk factor for heart disease, diabetes, and sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, a condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep, itself puts enormous strain on the heart and can lead to arrhythmias. Given his sedative use, his sleep would have been further compromised, possibly exacerbating undiagnosed sleep apnea. And then there's exercise, or rather, the lack of it in his later years. Despite his energetic stage performances, Elvis's daily routine was often sedentary when not touring. Lack of physical activity contributes to poor cardiovascular health, muscle weakness, and overall deconditioning. A pathologist would note that a person with such a lifestyle, even without drug abuse, would be at a higher risk of heart disease. The combination of poor diet, obesity, and lack of exercise also contributes to systemic inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation in the body is increasingly recognized as a driver of various diseases, including heart disease. While difficult to measure directly in a historical autopsy, a pathologist could infer these conditions from his documented habits. Also, consider his sleep patterns. Due to insomnia and performance schedules, he often took sedatives to sleep and stimulants to wake up. This constant disruption of his natural circadian rhythm would put his body under immense stress. Lack of restorative sleep is linked to high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease. For a pathologist, this relentless cycle of sleep deprivation and chemical induction would be another significant factor weakening his system. So, while the drugs may have been the proximate cause of death, his diet and lifestyle were the slow poisons that had been at work for years. They created a body already teetering on the edge, a body that was far less resilient to the chemical assault it endured. Any pathologist aiming for a truly comprehensive understanding would frame his death not just as an overdose, but as the final collapse of a system utterly worn out by years of destructive habits. Shocking questions. Could simple lifestyle choices be as deadly in the long run as chronic drug abuse? If Elvis had adopted a healthy diet and exercise regimen, could he have survived the drug abuse for longer? And how much does our culture's indulgence in unhealthy habits contribute to a silent epidemic of heart disease, even without overt drug involvement? Number 9, what if other undetected substances were involved? When forensic pathologists review a historical case, especially one with known drug involvement, they always have to consider the limitations of the technology and common practices of the time. In Elvis Presley's case, while the known drugs are extensively discussed, a pathologist would naturally ask what if there were other substances, either illicit or prescribed but unknown, that simply weren't detected by the methods available in 1977. Toxicology in the 1970s was far less sophisticated than today. Gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, GCMS was emerging, but the range of substances routinely screened for was narrower. Their labs focused on common narcotics, sedatives, and stimulants. Designer drugs or even less common prescription medications might have been missed if specific tests weren't ordered. One pathologist might theorize about illicit street drugs. While Elvis was known for his reliance on prescription medications, the possibility of occasional or intermittent use of non-prescribed illicit substances cannot be entirely ruled out. Perhaps a stimulant like cocaine or a different opioid obtained from sources outside Dr. Nick could have been present and metabolized quickly, or simply not part of the standard toxicology screen. If present, even in trace amounts or metabolized forms, they could have contributed to the overall toxic burden. Another possibility involves new synthetic drugs or compounds that weren't well understood or easily detectable at the time. The pharmaceutical landscape is always evolving. While less likely for Elvis given his known preferences, it's a what if a thorough pathologist would consider, even if just to dismiss it based on available information. Furthermore, some drugs metabolize very rapidly, leaving behind only trace metabolites or none at all by the time an autopsy and toxicology are performed. For example, some short-acting benzodiazepines or certain stimulants might have been ingested hours before death, played a role, but were mostly cleared from his system or converted into compounds not specifically looked for. This concept of rapid metabolism makes it difficult to ascertain acute ingestion of certain substances. Even within the realm of prescribed medications, could there have been something else? Elvis received numerous prescriptions from Dr. Nick, but also from other doctors and dentists. While Dr. Nick was the primary prescriber, the potential for other, less documented medications to have been in his system exists. A pathologist would inquire if all prescription records from all doctors were thoroughly compiled and cross-referenced, which can be challenging, especially for a famous individual with multiple care providers. And there's the issue of contaminants or adulterants in drugs. While Elvis primarily used prescription drugs, if he occasionally sought drugs from other sources, they might have contained unexpected and dangerous additives. In 1977, the regulation of illicit drug markets was, as now, non-existent, and substances could be cut with anything. So, while the existing toxicology reports pointed definitively to polypharmacy from known prescription drugs, a critical forensic mind would acknowledge the inherent limitations of 1977 technology. It's a question of absolute certainty. Could there be a missing piece, a phantom chemical that contributed to his demise but escaped detection? It remains a possibility, however remote, given the scientific constraints of the era. Shocking questions. Are we truly certain all substances in his system were identified, given the technology of 1977? Could rapidly metabolizing drugs have played a role and left no trace? And how many historical deaths attributed to one cause might be reevaluated with modern toxicology methods, potentially changing our understanding entirely? Number 8. How did his psychological state affect his physical health? Elvis Presley's life was a whirlwind of fame, pressure, isolation, and personal demons. For forensic pathologists, especially those with a holistic view of human health, it's impossible to ignore the profound impact of his psychological state on his physical well-being. The mind and body are intricately connected, and chronic mental distress can manifest in severe physiological deterioration, potentially contributing to his ultimate demise. Elvis suffered from significant depression, anxiety, and periods of paranoia. He was isolated despite being constantly surrounded by people. The immense pressure of maintaining his image, the relentless touring schedule, and the constant scrutiny would have taken an incredible toll. This chronic psychological stress elevates cortisol levels, often called the stress hormone. Sustained high cortisol levels are known to have detrimental effects on almost every organ system. One pathologist might connect chronic stress to cardiovascular damage. Research has consistently shown a link between chronic stress, depression, and an increased risk of heart disease, including hypertension and arrhythmias. The constant fight or flight response, even when not physically threatened, keeps the heart rate elevated, blood vessels constricted, and the entire system under strain. This could have weakened his already compromised heart, making it more susceptible to failure. Another aspect is the self-medication cycle. Elvis's drug abuse wasn't just recreational, it was largely an attempt to cope with his psychological pain. He used sedatives to escape anxiety and achieve sleep, and stimulants to combat the lethargy caused by the sedatives and to perform. This cycle of self-medication is a direct manifestation of his psychological struggles, and it directly led to the polypharmacy that pathologists point to as the cause of death. So his mental state wasn't just a contributing factor, it was the driver of the very behavior that killed him. His relationships were often tumultuous, adding to his emotional burden. The divorce from Priscilla, the various affairs, the complex relationship with his manager Colonel Tom Parker, all these would fuel his anxiety and depression. Pathologists wouldn't just look at the physical body, they'd consider the social autopsy, examining the life circumstances that impacted his health. Furthermore, chronic depression often leads to neglect of self-care. This ties directly into his poor diet and lack of exercise. When deeply depressed, individuals often lose motivation to engage in healthy behaviors, creating a downward spiral that impacts physical health. This is a common observation in clinical practice and would be noted by a pathologist looking at the complete picture. So, while a pathologist cannot directly identify depression as a cause of death in an autopsy report, they would understand that his profound and chronic psychological distress created the perfect storm for physical collapse. It drove his drug abuse, compromised his cardiovascular system, and contributed to a general state of ill health that made his body unable to withstand the final chemical assault. His mind was in torment, and his body eventually gave out under that sustained pressure. The shocking questions: could a broken heart, figuratively speaking, literally lead to physical heart failure? If Elvis had received appropriate and effective mental health care, could his life have taken a drastically different turn? And how much do we underestimate the silent killers of chronic stress and depression in public figures, attributing their demise solely to more visible causes? Number 7, was the scene of death properly investigated for clues? The investigation of the scene where a person dies is fundamental to forensic pathology. It provides crucial context for interpreting autopsy findings. In Elvis Presley's case, he was found by Ginger Alden in the bathroom of his Graceland mansion. For 18 forensic pathologists, revisiting the scene, even hypothetically, would be paramount, and questions would arise about the thoroughness of the original scene investigation in 1977. One pathologist might focus on the precise location and posture of the body. That Elvis was found face down near the toilet. Did he collapse suddenly? Was he trying to get to the toilet? The position could offer clues about the immediate physiological event. For instance, straining during a bowel movement, as discussed earlier, could trigger a vagal response. His position might support this theory if he was in the act of, or attempting, defecation. Another pathologist would consider the immediate environment. What was on the counter? Were there any medications readily accessible, any empty containers, any evidence of drug paraphernalia, needles, spoons, etc., even though his primary method was ingestion? While no illicit drug paraphernalia was publicly reported, a thorough scene investigation would document every item. The types and locations of medications found, even if prescribed, would provide insight into his habits leading up to his death. The presence or absence of vomit or other bodily fluids is also critical. If he experienced a sudden cardiac event, there might have been a gasp and aspiration of gastric contents. If he suffered respiratory depression, there might have been a more gradual loss of consciousness. The presence of vomit could indicate a specific type of collapse or a reaction to drugs. The initial reports were vague on these details, and what about the sequence of events? Ginger Alden found him. Who else entered the scene immediately? How was the body handled? Was anything moved before medical personnel arrived? In a high-profile case, the immediate chaos and desire to help or even to protect an image can inadvertently compromise a scene. A modern pathologist would want precise documentation from first responders, even amateur photos if available. The timeline is also crucial. When was he last seen alive and lucid? When was he discovered? This time window helps pathologists estimate the timeline of events leading to death. And Elvis had been up that night, reading, taking medication, then went into the bathroom. How long was he there before he was found? A shorter interval might suggest a more acute event. A pathologist familiar with medical death investigation protocols would note that a detailed scene diagram, photographs from multiple angles, and a comprehensive inventory of all items found are standard practice. The publicly available information from 1977 doesn't suggest this level of meticulousness was applied, possibly due to the shock, the celebrity status, or simply the standards of the time. So, while the basic facts are known, the depth of the initial scene investigation is a question mark. For pathologists, it's not just about what happened, but where and how. The scene often tells a silent story that complements the findings of the autopsy. Shocking questions. Did the initial investigators miss subtle environmental clues that could have refined our understanding of his final moments? How much did the celebrity status of the deceased impact the thoroughness or objectivity of the scene investigation? And could a modern forensic team, given the ability to reprocess the scene, uncover entirely new insights? Number 6, could sudden cardiac death be a standalone explanation without drug influence? This question forces forensic pathologists to consider an alternative, or at least a parallel, pathway to Elvis Presley's death. Could he have died from sudden cardiac death, SCD, that was largely independent of his drug use, perhaps due to an undiagnosed genetic condition or an underlying heart problem, only exacerbated by his lifestyle? It's a crucial distinction to explore. SCD is defined as natural death from cardiac causes, usually within 1 hour of the onset of symptoms, in a person not known to have had a potentially fatal cardiac condition. However, many SCD cases are later found to have underlying structural heart disease or primary electrical abnormalities. Elvis was 42 while young. For a typical heart attack, it's not unheard of for SCD. One pathologist might point to Elvis's family history, if available and carefully reviewed. Are there any familial patterns of early heart disease or sudden unexplained deaths? This information can sometimes point to inherited cardiac conditions like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy HCM, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy RVC, or long QT syndrome LQTS, which can cause sudden death even in seemingly healthy individuals. While his autopsy noted an enlarged heart, this could be due to HCM, which often goes undiagnosed until a fatal event. Another pathologist might consider the autopsy findings more closely. The reported enlarged heart is consistent with several conditions. It could be athlete's heart, unlikely for his later sedentary lifestyle, hypertensive heart disease due to high blood pressure or cardiomyopathy. If the enlargement was disproportionate or showed specific patterns, e.g. asymmetrical septal hypertrophy, it might suggest a genetic cardiomyopathy. Modern pathology uses advanced histology and even genetic testing post-mortem to diagnose these conditions, which wasn't possible in 1977. The fact that Elvis was a heavy smoker, though, often overlooked in his medical narrative and had an unhealthy diet, also predisposed him to cardiovascular disease. These are conventional risk factors for atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease, which can lead to heart attacks. Even if drugs accelerated his decline, these underlying issues would have been present. However, most pathologists would still struggle to entirely separate SCD from his drug abuse. The polypharmacy directly affects cardiac electrical activity and respiratory function, which are the immediate pathways to cardiac arrest. Even if he had an underlying predisposition, the drugs almost certainly acted as a powerful trigger or accelerant. It would be difficult to prove that the drugs played no role at all, but the theoretical possibility remains: what if Elvis had a silent killer in his heart, a ticking time bomb unrelated to his addiction, that simply chose that moment to detonate? The drugs might have just been incidental or merely the final push to an already inevitable event. It's a challenging hypothesis to prove or disprove without more detailed initial cardiac pathology and modern genetic screening. But for a thorough forensic analysis, it must be considered. Shocking questions: was Elvis predisposed to sudden cardiac death regardless of his drug use? And if so, how would that change our perception of his culpability in his own demise? Could a modern autopsy, with genetic testing, uncover a silent genetic heart condition that science couldn't identify in 1977? And how many cases of sudden unexplained death in young adults go undiagnosed for underlying genetic causes? Number 5. What if a slower, more insidious process was at play, culminating that day? This perspective shifts away from a single acute event, whether a heart attack or an overdose, and instead views Elvis Presley's death as the inevitable culmination of a long, slow process of physiological decline. For many forensic pathologists, especially those who appreciate the complexity of chronic illness and addiction, Elvis's death wasn't a sudden surprise, but the final chapter of a protracted battle his body was losing. Imagine Elvis's body as an old house, battered by years of neglect and repeated abuse. Each system was compromised. His heart was enlarged and stressed. His liver was burdened by constant detoxification. His kidneys were working overtime, his colon was severely dysfunctional, leading to chronic pain and potential toxin buildup. His respiratory system was likely weakened by sedatives and possible undiagnosed sleep apnea. One pathologist might focus on the concept of failure to thrive in adults, a less common but relevant diagnosis describing a general physical decline and loss of physical function, often associated with multiple chronic illnesses, poor nutrition, and psychological factors. And Elvis exhibited many of these symptoms in his later years: increasing frailty, difficulty with mobility, episodes of confusion, and a general inability to maintain his health despite resources. Another pathologist might emphasize multi-organ system dysfunction. The cumulative effect of years of polypharmacy and an unhealthy lifestyle meant that no single organ was truly healthy. Each system was operating at a reduced capacity, interdependent, and constantly compensating for the others. When one system falters, it drags the others down. His death, in this view, wasn't a single point of failure, but a systemic collapse. Consider the role of inflammation. Chronic drug use, obesity, and an unhealthy diet all contribute to systemic inflammation. Over years, this low-grade, persistent inflammation can damage tissues and organs, accelerating aging and disease processes. A pathologist might hypothesize that his entire vascular system, for example, was riddled with micro-inflammatory lesions, making him vulnerable to a catastrophic event. This perspective doesn't negate the role of drugs. Instead, it places the drug abuse within the larger context of a body systematically failing. The drugs weren't just an acute trigger, they were a chronic, destructive force that gradually eroded his body's reserves and resilience. The final lethal dose, or combination of drugs, was simply the straw that broke the camel's back, a back already buckling under immense weight. Dr. Forrest Tennant, in his later review, eloquently argued for this slow decline. He suggested that Elvis's various medical conditions, including his colon and spinal problems, were so severe they themselves required massive doses of painkillers. This wasn't just addiction, it was chronic, debilitating illness driving the drug use, which in turn accelerated the overall decline. His body was essentially a battlefield, and it was slowly being worn down until it could no longer fight. So, while the morning of August 16, 1977 was the date of his official death, many pathologists would argue that the process of dying had been underway for years. It was an insidious, relentless march toward physiological failure, with each day bringing him closer to the inevitable collapse. Shocking questions. Was August 16, 1977 just an arbitrary end date for a man whose body was already deeply compromised and slowly dying? Could modern medicine have intervened to reverse such a pervasive systemic decline, or was it too far gone? And how many other cases of apparent sudden death are actually the final act of a long, hidden process of physiological decay? Number 4, how would modern forensic techniques change the findings? Revisiting Elvis Presley's death with today's forensic science capabilities would be a vastly different undertaking than the examination performed in 1977. For 18 forensic pathologists, the hypothetical opportunity to apply modern techniques would undoubtedly shed new, potentially revolutionary light on his cause of death. First, toxicology testing has advanced enormously. In 1977, the range of drugs screened for was limited. Today, labs can detect hundreds, even thousands, of substances and their metabolites with incredible precision and sensitivity. Gas chromatography, mass spectrometry (GC-MS), and liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry (LC-MS) are now routine and far more powerful, able to identify trace amounts of drugs, including designer drugs or less common substances that might have been missed. Furthermore, post-mortem toxicology can now better account for post-mortem redistribution, offering more accurate estimates of drug concentrations at the time of death. This could confirm or refute the specific roles of each drug with much greater certainty. Second, imaging technologies like post-mortem CT scans or MRI would provide a non-invasive, yet incredibly detailed, view of his internal organs before the traditional autopsy began. These scans could reveal subtle structural abnormalities in his heart, e.g., specific types of cardiomyopathy, coronary artery anomalies, brain, e.g., signs of chronic hypoxia, stroke, or other organs, e.g., precise extent of liver or kidney damage, detailed view of his megacolon, and any impaction that might have been overlooked or difficult to assess with gross examination alone. Third, histopathology microscopic examination of tissues is far more advanced. Pathologists could perform ultra-detailed studies of heart tissue to look for specific types of fibrosis, inflammation, or early signs of genetic heart disease. And lung tissue could be examined for evidence of chronic respiratory issues or aspiration. Brain tissue could be examined for subtle signs of drug-induced changes or chronic hypoxia. Immunohistochemistry, a technique that uses antibodies to detect specific proteins in tissues, could identify markers of inflammation or cellular stress. Fourth, genetic testing, pharmacogenomics, and cardiac genetics would be a game changer. DNA extracted from tissue samples could be analyzed to identify genetic predispositions to certain heart conditions like long QT syndrome or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It could also reveal how Elvis metabolized specific drugs, whether he was a rapid or slow metabolizer, which would profoundly affect how his body reacted to the prescribed medications. This would add an entirely new layer of understanding to the polypharmacy effect. Fifth, neuropathology. While an autopsy often examines the brain, a specialized neuropathological examination could look for signs of chronic opioid effects or the impact of long-term sedation and stimulants on brain chemistry and structure. While not directly a cause of death, it would offer insights into his cognitive and psychological state. Finally, the entire scene investigation would be conducted with rigorous protocols, including 3D laser scanning of the scene, detailed forensic photography, and meticulous evidence collection, ensuring no detail is missed or compromised. With these tools, pathologists could definitively pinpoint the exact physiological sequence of events, distinguish between acute and chronic drug effects, identify any genetic vulnerabilities, and provide a far more nuanced and conclusive understanding of Elvis Presley's complex demise. It would be a scientific autopsy replacing speculation with hard data. Shocking questions: would a modern autopsy confirm or completely refute the original findings and possibly even the later polypharmacy conclusions? Could new genetic insights shift the blame from drug abuse to an inherent biological vulnerability? And how many historical mysteries of death could be definitively solved with today's scientific advancements? Number 3, was there pressure to clean up the official narrative? The death of a global icon, like Elvis Presley, is never just a private matter. It's a public spectacle, and the official narrative of his passing can carry immense weight, affecting his legacy, his family, and even economic interests. For forensic pathologists looking back at the 1977 investigation, a critical question would be, was there pressure, overt or subtle, to clean up the official narrative, to minimize scandalous details, and to present a more palatable cause of death? Many pathologists, especially those familiar with high-profile cases, would immediately suspect such pressures. In 1977, Elvis Presley was still a massive cultural phenomenon. The idea that the king died from drug abuse would have been devastating to his image, his family's grief, and the vast industry built around him. The actions of Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner, are central here. His initial swift pronouncement that Elvis died of cardiac arrhythmia with no evidence of any other contributing disease or condition, such as drug abuse, is highly suspect to a modern forensic mind. To make such a definitive statement before toxicology results were fully analyzed, and in direct contradiction to Elvis's well-documented medical history, suggests external influence or a significant lack of rigor. A pathologist would see this as a potential compromise of scientific objectivity for the sake of public relations. The family's desire for privacy and protection of Elvis's image is understandable. Priscilla Presley later spoke about the family's wish to keep the details private. This familial pressure, while emotionally driven, can translate into requests or expectations for discretion from official channels. While not necessarily a malicious cover-up, it creates an environment where unpleasant truths might be softened or omitted from public statements. And there's the broader issue of the Elvis Inc. empire. A drug-related death could have jeopardized future earnings, merchandise sales, and the carefully cultivated image of a beloved star. While purely speculative, the financial implications of such a revelation might have created an unspoken pressure on authorities to handle the situation delicately. The subsequent review of his death in 1994, which explicitly concluded that polypharmacy was a major contributing factor, strongly implies that the original narrative was indeed cleaned up. The later panel essentially reversed or significantly modified Dr. Francisco's initial public statements, suggesting those statements were, at best, premature and, at worst, misleading. The very existence of this later review, nearly 2 decades after his death, indicates lingering dissatisfaction and questions about the original report's integrity. A pathologist today would emphasize that truth and transparency are paramount in forensic science. Any deviation from strict scientific objectivity, whether due to celebrity status, family wishes, or commercial interests, undermines the credibility of the entire process. The public and future generations deserve an honest accounting. So, While direct evidence of a conspiracy to fabricate findings might be hard to pinpoint, the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests that the official narrative was, at the very least, carefully managed to present a less controversial version of Elvis Presley's death. The goal was to protect the legend, but at the cost of full medical transparency. Shocking questions: was truth sacrificed for the legend, and how deeply does celebrity status impact official investigations? Could a more honest and transparent initial report have changed the course of public health discussions around prescription drug abuse decades ago? And how many other public figures' deaths have been given a clean narrative to protect their image? Number 2, what about the specific physiological mechanism of his collapse? For forensic pathologists, especially those interested in the minute-by-minute progression of death, the question isn't just what killed Elvis, but the precise how. What was the exact physiological sequence of events that led to his heart stopping? This delves into the cellular and systemic cascade of his final moments. One pathologist might theorize a primary respiratory depression. With the high levels of multiple central nervous system depressants, opioids, and sedatives, his breathing would have become increasingly shallow and slow. This hypoventilation would lead to hypoxia, lack of oxygen in the blood, and hypercapnia, a buildup of carbon dioxide. Both hypoxia and hypercapnia put immense strain on the heart. The heart, deprived of oxygen and struggling against acidic blood due to CO2 buildup, would develop an arrhythmia, a fatal irregular heartbeat, leading to cardiac arrest. This is a common mechanism in opioid and sedative overdoses. Another pathologist might argue for a direct cardiotoxic effect. While respiratory depression is common, certain drugs, especially in combination, can directly impair the heart's electrical system, causing an immediate, fatal arrhythmia without necessarily a prolonged period of hypoxia. This could involve prolonging the QT interval, as mentioned before, or directly depressing myocardial contractility. The suddenness of Elvis's collapse, as implied by finding him on the bathroom floor, might support a more acute cardiac event rather than a slow, gradual respiratory decline. Then there's the vagal response, tied to his chronic constipation. If he was straining severely on the toilet, the increased vagal tone could have caused a sudden, profound bradycardia, slow heart rate, or asystole. In a system already compromised by polypharmacy, this vagal stimulation could have been the final trigger, causing the heart to simply stop. This would also lead to a rapid collapse. The interplay of these mechanisms is critical. It's unlikely to be one single isolated pathway. For example, respiratory depression could lead to hypoxia, which then makes the heart more susceptible to a vagal event or a direct drug-induced arrhythmia. It's a cascading failure. The drugs had already weakened his respiratory drive and directly affected his heart's electrical stability. The final stressor, whether it was straining or just the cumulative peak effect of the drugs, pushed him over the edge. A pathologist with expertise in cardiac electrophysiology would be invaluable here. They would examine the likely effects of each drug on the heart's conduction system, looking at how the combined pharmacological profile would specifically increase the risk of ventricular fibrillation or asystole. They might consider models of drug interaction and how they impact action potentials in cardiac muscle cells. The key challenge for any pathologist is that while the end result, cardiac arrest, is known, the precise cellular and physiological sequence of events that led to it can only be inferred from the available evidence. Without continuous physiological monitoring in his final moments, it's a reconstruction based on probabilities and known medical effects. But understanding this sequence provides the most granular and complete picture of how Elvis Presley died. Shocking questions. Could his last moments be reconstructed with more certainty? And how close can we get to understanding the precise cellular events that led to his death? Was it truly a moment of choice, or was his body beyond his control in those final seconds? And how many other deaths could be better understood if we could precisely map the physiological cascade leading to collapse? Number 1. What is the most likely comprehensive explanation, considering all evidence? After reviewing all the angles, all the possibilities, and all the what-ifs from 18 different forensic pathologists, a consensus would likely emerge. The most probable comprehensive explanation for Elvis Presley's death is not a simple one. It is a multifactorial tragedy, a perfect storm of chronic illness, relentless drug abuse, a compromised medical system, and a vulnerable famous individual. The primary and most immediate cause of his cardiac arrest was acute polypharmacy. This means the toxic interaction of multiple prescription drugs, Dilaudid, Percodan, Demerol, codeine, Quaaludes, and others found in his system. These drugs, all central nervous system depressants, synergistically suppress his respiratory drive, leading to hypoxia, and directly affected his heart's electrical activity, precipitating a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. This is the conclusion reached by the panel of experts in 1994, and it is overwhelmingly supported by modern toxicology and pharmacology. However, this acute event did not occur in a vacuum. It was built upon a foundation of severe chronic illness and physiological decline. His enlarged colon megacolon caused him debilitating pain and chronic constipation, which not only contributed to his painkiller reliance, but also posed a direct risk through vagal stimulation during straining. His heart was already enlarged and stressed from years of an unhealthy diet, obesity, and the constant cycling of stimulants and depressants. His liver and kidneys were likely under immense strain, further compromising his body's ability to process and eliminate toxins. His medical care, particularly from Dr. George Nikopoulos, played a significant enabling role. The vast quantities of powerful drugs prescribed, often indiscriminately and for extended periods, directly fueled his addiction and created the environment for polypharmacy. While Dr. Nick may have believed he was controlling the situation, his actions ultimately contributed to the chemical overload in Elvis's system. Moreover, Elvis's psychological state, his battles with depression, anxiety, and the immense pressure of fame drove his self-medication. His physical health and mental health were inextricably linked, each exacerbating the other in a vicious cycle. The psychological torment pushed him deeper into drug dependence, which in turn accelerated his physical deterioration. So, in the most comprehensive view, Elvis Presley's death was the culmination of chronic, severe prescription drug abuse that caused systemic organ damage and led to an acute fatal cardiac arrhythmia. This was exacerbated by underlying medical conditions, a detrimental lifestyle, and questionable medical oversight, all against the backdrop of immense psychological distress and the pressures of celebrity. His death was not a simple heart attack, nor was it a straightforward overdose of a single substance. It was the catastrophic failure of a complex human system, overwhelmed by years of abuse, and ultimately unable to withstand the cumulative assaults of powerful chemicals. It was a preventable tragedy, but one that spiraled out of control due to a multitude of intertwined factors. Shocking questions. Will we ever truly know every detail of Elvis's last moments, or is this the closest we will get to a complete understanding? Could a more robust medical system or stronger ethical guidelines have saved him, even given his fame and demands? And how many other hidden truths about celebrity deaths remain buried, waiting for future forensic scrutiny?